Hey everyone, this is chapter 8 of The Nature of Stalinist Russia by Tony Cliff. It's from 1948. Chapter 8 is titled Russian Economy and the Capitalist Crisis. The headings include the tremendous tempo of development of the productive forces in Stalinist Russia. How can we explain this extraordinary tempo of development? The causes of capitalist crisis. State capitalism in the crisis, the posing of the problem. Hayek, Tugen-Baranovsky, why the Hayek-Tugen quote solution is impossible under individual capitalism. The Hayek-Tugen quote solution can be realized for a certain time under state capitalism. Bukharin on the crisis in state capitalism. Will the development of production in a state capitalist economy receive a cyclical form? How will state capitalism try to overcome the stagnation, production and consumption of means of destruction, the perspectives of Russian economy, and the social character of the regime? This is probably going to need me to do two parts of it. I think it might take me over an hour to read this, so I'm probably going to break this chapter up into two parts. So this is part 1. Anyway, section 1. The tremendous tempo of development of the productive forces in Stalinist Russia. The tempo of development of the productive forces in Stalinist Russia is greater than it has been in any other country at any time. According to Soviet statistics, the industrial production in the years 1928 to 40, measured in 1926/27 prices, multiplied 7.5 times. This is undoubtedly highly exaggerated. Thus, for instance, while the value of machinery and steel products multiplied 13 times, the volume of the coal, iron, and steel output multiplied only 3 to 5 times. As volumes are much more difficult to falsify than price calculations, we may assume that production really multiplied about 5 times between 1928 and 1940. Even this figure shows that extraordinarily rapid progress was made. Let us compare it with peak periods of the rise of industrial output in some important countries. In the United States between 1880 and 1890, when industrial production rose relatively quickest, it multiplied 2.2 times. In England between 1860 and 1870, it multiplied 1.29 times. In Germany between 1914 and 1923, it multiplied 1.81 times. In France between 1920 and 1930, it multiplied 2.2 times. In Tsarist Russia between 1890 and 1900, it multiplied 2.5 times. And between 1910 and 1913, 1.68 times. Section 2. How can we explain this extraordinary tempo of development? The first reason is that a clean sweep was made of feudalism by the October Revolution. The second reason is the tremendous natural wealth of Russia. Thirdly, the fact that world technique has advanced much beyond what it was at the time of the industrialization of England, France, Germany, and the U.S. made it possible for Russia to adopt the last word in technique, and in this way to stride very rapidly forward. This factor is connected with the fourth. The fact that Russian industry was built, so to say, from scratch meant that the introduction of modern methods of production did not meet the obstacle produced by the existence of old means of production, which was and is a great hindrance in many countries, particularly Britain. The fifth reason is that there are no monopolist organizations, cartels, syndicates, or trusts which are interested in a, quote, policy of scarcity as a means of raising the rate of profit. The sixth reason is the control of the state over the different elements of the process of reproduction, consumption and accumulation, movement of workers in the labor market, etc., etc. The control of the state over the economy as a whole makes it possible to depress the standard of living of the masses to a very low level, to produce a very small quantity of means of production, of consumption, and to divert capital and labor power to the production of new means of production. This is indeed the most important factor explaining Russia's quick tempo of industrialization. Footnote: some of these factors also explain the extraordinarily rapid development of Japanese industry. End footnote. As we shall see below, the last reason, together with the fact that Stalinist Russia began to develop its industry at a time when its productive forces were very much lower than those of the capitalist world as a whole, explain the non-existence hitherto of crises or stagnation. This constitutes the seventh reason for the great expansion of the productive forces in Stalinist Russia. The question of Russian economy and the trade cycles, however, needs special elaboration. Before doing this, let us first of all summarize the Marxian interpretation of the crisis of overproduction, and then we can tackle the question of whether state capitalism can avoid such crises, and if so, how. Section 3. The causes of capitalist crisis. In contradistinction to the pre-capitalist forms of production, accumulation, that is, reproduction on an enlarged scale, is an inner necessity of the capitalist form of production. But reproduction on an enlarged scale meets with two obstacles which, although complementary, are yet contradictory. They both arise out of itself and oppose themselves to it. The one is the decline of the rate of profit, which means the decline of the sources of accumulation for reproduction on an enlarged scale. The other is the increase of production above and beyond the market. If not for the first contradiction, the quote, under-consumptionist concept of how to overcome the crisis by raising the wages of the workers would have been a simple and excellent method. If not for the second contradiction, fascism, by a continuous cutting of wages, could have saved capitalism from the crisis for at least quite a long period. Let us begin with the first side of the dilemma of capitalism. The low purchasing power of the masses is a cause of overproduction. Marx writes, quote, the entire mass of commodities, the total product, which contains a portion which is to reproduce the constant and variable capital, as well as a portion representing surplus value, must be sold. If this is not done, or only partly accomplished, or only at prices which are below the prices of production, the laborer has been none the less exploited, but his exploitation does not realize as much for the capitalist. It may yield no surplus value at all for him, or only realize a portion of the produced surplus value, or it may even mean a partial or complete loss of his capital. The conditions of direct exploitation and those of the realization of surplus value are not identical. They are separated logically as well as by time and space. The first are only limited by the productive power of society, the last by the proportional relations of the various lines of production, and by the consuming power of society. This last named power is determined either by the absolute productive power, is not determined either by the absolute productive power, nor by the absolute consuming power, but by the consuming power based on antagonistic conditions of distribution, which reduces the consumption of the great mass of the population to a variable minimum within more or less narrow limits. The consuming power is furthermore restricted by the tendency to accumulate, the greed for an expansion of capital, and a production of surplus value on an enlarged scale. End quote. Marx. Capital, Volume 3, page 286. And Marx adds, quote, the stupendous productive power developing under the capitalist mode of production relatively to population, and the increase, though not in the same proportion, of capital values, not their material substance, which grew much more rapidly than the population, contradict the basis, which compared to the expanding wealth, is ever narrowing and for which this immense productive power works, and the conditions under which capital augments its value. This is the cause of crises, end quote. Marx. Marx formulated, and that's also in Capital Volume 3, pages 312 to 313. Marx formulated the same idea in another place thus, quote, the last cause of all real crises always remains the poverty and restricted consumption of the masses, as compared to the tendency of capitalist production to develop the productive forces in such a way that only the absolute power of consumption of the entire society would be their limit. End quote. Marx, Capital Volume 3, page 568. In the last analysis, in the last analysis, the cause of the capitalist crisis is rooted in the fact that a greater and greater part of the income of society falls into the hands of the capitalist class, and a greater and greater part of this is directed not towards buying means of consumption, but means of production. Is directed towards the accumulation of capital. But seeing that all means of production are potentially means of consumption, i.e. that after a certain lapse of time the value of the means of production becomes incorporated in means of consumption, therefore the relative increase in the part of the national income directed to accumulation, as against that part directed towards consumption, must necessarily bring with it overproduction. And this is a cumulative process. The increase in accumulation is accompanied by rationalization, and therefore brings in its wake an increase in the rate of exploitation. The greater the rate of exploitation, the greater the fund from which accumulation is drawn, as against the wages of the workers and the revenue of the capitalist directed to consumption. The greater the accumulation, the greater the drive towards additional accumulation. If, quote, the poverty and restricted consumption of the masses, end quote, were the only cause of the capitalist crisis, the crisis would exist as a permanent phenomenon, as the wages of the workers always lag behind the rise in the productivity of labor. We should then not have known the one-time catastrophic equation of different elements. But seeing why the crisis is not permanent, let's first of all deal with the second side of the dilemma of capitalism, the decline of the rate of profit. The process of capital accumulation is accompanied by a rise in the organic composition of capital, in other words, the substitution of living labor by dead labor. That is not what organic composition of capital is. That's the technical composition of capital. The organic composition is the composition of capital as dictated by the technical composition, the material composition of capital, the material living labor, and the material dead labor. The organic composition is measured in value terms, not in in natura terms. That's very important. So the accumulation, this is kind of going to be important for whether Coates' theory pans out or not, or like works out or not, is if he can actually use these terms properly. Anyway, the process of capital accumulation is accompanied by a rise in the organic composition of capital, in other words, the substitution of living labor by dead labor. Living labor produces surplus value, dead labor does not. This causes the constant tendency of the decline of the rate of profit. The decline of the rate of profit on its side sharpens the competition between the capitalists, each of whom tries to increase his profit at the expense of his rivals. This competition pushes ahead the rationalization of production, which causes the organic composition of capital to rise even more, and so the vicious circle begins again. Again, this is kind of like Michael Heinrich's critique, so I'm going to riff on him is that the organic composition, granted that it's not the same thing as the technical composition, the labor intensivity of the production process of a particular capital, but is a value. It's a value composition. If the means of production, even if you use more of them, if they become cheaper relative to labor, that fundamentally changes the organic composition of capital, right? In a way that's can't be fully captured by a strictly material in natura understanding of the composition. So, yeah. That's important. So Michael Heinrich being one of the main people who's like doesn't think the right fall, the tendency of the law of the rate of profit to fall is true, and he thinks that there's even some hints in Marx that he didn't think it was true, and at the very least he argues that Marx does not, this thing that Marxists have made such a thing about, Marx does not talk about again, really, after the early 1860s when he writes what would be the manuscripts, I think it's 1864 to 65 manuscripts, in which he wrote what we know as Capital Volume 3. He doesn't continue to talk on about it. It's not like a major part of his consideration, like it becomes for like other people, other theorists of capitalism's crises. Anyway, the decline of the rate of profit on its side sharpens the competition between the capitalists. Each of whom tries to increase his profit at the expense of his rivals. This competition pushes ahead the rationalization of production, which causes the organic composition of capital to rise even more, and so the vicious circle begins again. This tendency alone does not explain the cyclical movement of revival, boom, crisis, and depression. Marx explains that the decline of the rate of profit, which results from the raising of the organic composition of capital, is a very slow process. Which comes up against many counteracting forces. Many counteracting forces, he says here, which I think is also the thing that Heinrich says, is that even if you can say that there's a decline in the rate of profit, it would have to be extremely swift for it to have the kind of explanatory power, for the theory of it to have the kind of explanatory power which certain Marxists attribute to it, right? I think there's also things in Rosa Luxemburg that say, like, more or less, like, the fall of the rate of profit is so slow, that it's, like, not worth considering. It's like, if the rate of profit drops some very infinitesimal level over the course of 100 years, who gives a shit? In terms of, like, what it means, it doesn't really, it's not important. And it's certainly not, like, the final catastrophe of capitalism. Anyway, the decline of the rate of profit constitutes the background of the economic cycle. The immediate cause of the cycle must be sought in the changes in the wage rate, which result from the changes in the demand for labor power accompanying the process of accumulation. Marx writes clearly about the decline of the rate of profit, quote, "It promotes overproduction, speculation, surplus capital, along with surplus population." Marx. Capital, Volume 3, page... I don't remember which footnote it is. End quote, Marx. Capital, Volume 3. Quote, "The barrier of the capitalist mode of production becomes apparent. 1. In the fact that the development of the productive power of labor creates in the falling rate of profit a law which turns into an antagonism of this mode of production at a certain point and requires for its defeat periodical crises." End quote. Marx. Capital, Volume 3, page 303. As regards the rise of the wage level in the wake of the increased employment during a boom, Marx writes that if it were said, quote, ... that the working class received too small a portion of their own product, and the evil would be remedied by giving them a larger share of their own product, or raising their wages, we should reply that crises are precisely always preceded by a period in which wages rise generally, and the working class actually get a larger share of the annual product intended for consumption. End quote. Marx. Capital, Volume 2, pages 475 to 476. On the connection between the trade cycle, 2, the rate of profit, 3, the level of wages, and 4, the extent of unemployment. When the last factor takes on decisive importance in the ending of the boom and the heralding of the crisis, Marx writes, quote, "The whole form of the movement of modern industry depends, therefore, upon the constant transformation of a part of the laboring population into unemployed or half-employed hands, ... As the heavenly bodies, once thrown into a certain definite motion, always repeat this definite motion, so it is with social production. As soon as social production is once thrown into the movement of alternate expansion and contraction, effects in their turn become causes, and the varying accidents of the whole process, which always reproduces its own conditions, takes on the form of periodicity. End quote. Marx, Capital Volume 1, page 694 to 695, and footnote. The causal connection between the rate of profit, capital accumulation, the extent of employment, and the level of wages may be described thus. The rate of profit determines the rate of accumulation. The rate of accumulation determines the extent of employment. The extent of employment determines the level of wages. The level of wages determines the rate of profit, and so on in a vicious circle. A high rate of profit means a quick accumulation, which means an increase in employment and a rise in wages. The cumulative process proceeds to a point where the rise in wage rates so adversely affects the rate of profit that accumulation either declines catastrophically or ceases altogether. The material basis which unites the cycle of the rate of profit and the cycle of accumulation and the cycle of employment is the life cycle of fixed capital, i.e. machinery, buildings, etc., in parentheses. Quote, to the same extent that the volume of the value and the duration of the fixed capital, if you don't know, he says it right here, fixed capital, i.e. machinery, buildings, etc., is capital whose value drips into the commodities produced by that capital over time, right? So, for instance, if you're buying something that, if a capitalist buys a piece of machinery that it uses over and over again, the value of that piece of machinery is not going to be transferred into, the first commodity that it produces. It's going to be the value, that depreciation is going to drip into the commodities it produces over time. Sorry. Just wanted to make sure everyone knew what the hell he was talking about here. Quote, to the same extent that the volume of the value and the duration of the fixed capital develop with the evolution of the capitalist mode of production, does the life of industry and of industrial capital develop in each particular investment into one of many years, say of 10 years on an average. If the development of fixed capital extends the length of this life on the one side, it is on the other side shortened by the continuous revolution of the instruments of production, which likewise increases incessantly with the development of capitalist production. This implies a change in the instruments of production and the necessity of continuous replacement on account of virtual wear and tear, long before they are worn out physically. One may assume that this life cycle, in the essential branches of great industry, now average 10 years. However, it is not a question of any one definite number here. So much at least it is evident that this cycle comprising a number of years, through which capital is compelled to pass by its fixed part, furnishes a material basis for the periodical commercial crises in which businesses go through successive periods of lassitude, average activity, overspeeding, and crisis. It is true that the periods in which capital is invested are different in time and place, but a crisis is always the starting point of a large amount of new investments. Therefore, it also constitutes, from the point of view of society, more or less a new material basis for the next cycle of turnover. End quote. Marx. Where the hell am I? Marx, Capital, Volume 2. This explains why, despite the antagonistic mode of distribution and the tendency of the rate of profit to decline, there is not a permanent crisis of overproduction, but a cyclical movement of the economy. During the period of renewal and addition to fixed capital, there is no direct relationship between the immediate introduction of new means of production and the addition to the supply of finished goods. After a certain lapse of time, running into a few years, the value of the new means of production begin to be incorporated in new products, means of production and means of consumption alike. This takes place without any, or with only a relatively small amount of, capital investment taking place at the time. Thus, capitalism experiences a period of a few years in which investments in the construction of new industries or the expansion of existing industries are very large compared with the rise in the output of finished goods. These are the years of boom. Following this, there's a period in which the output of finished goods expands considerably almost simultaneously with a decline in the rate of accumulation. This is the crest of the boom and the harbinger of the coming crisis. Then comes the crisis. Production declines catastrophically while investments disappear or even give place to disinvestment. Bound up with the declining rate of profit in its two aspects, the general tendency towards the decline of the rate of profit and its cyclical movement, and with it the, quote, restricted consumption of the masses, end quote, both as cause and as a result, is another important factor, the disproportionality between different industries. The disproportionality between different industries may be the direct result of the anarchic character of capitalist production. In this case, the capitalists of one industry overestimate the demand for that industry for those capitalist products, and therefore overexpand the productive capacity of the industry. As the number of capitalists is large, it is only after production has taken place that the capitalist becomes aware through the market that supply has exceeded the demand. Overproduction in one branch of industry thus causes a decline in prices, decline of profits, a restriction in production, and a decline in the demand for labor power, raw materials and machinery produced by other factories, etc. This restriction is not necessarily compensated for by the expansion of production in other industries. On the contrary, the contraction of production in one industry brings in its wake a contraction of production in other industries, directly or indirectly dependent on it. If the industry which suffers initially from overproduction is an important industry, the cumulative result of this disproportionality between this industry and the rest of the economy can be a general crisis. Marx said, quote, that a crisis, and hence also overproduction, be general, it is enough that it seize hold of the leading articles of commerce, end quote. Marx, Theories of Surplus Value, Volume 2, quoted in Paul Sweezy's The Theory of Capitalist Development, published in 1946. In this case, the disproportionality between different industries is the cause of the decline of the rate of profit and the decline of the consumption of the masses, and these three factors together bring about the crisis. It may also happen, however, that the disproportionality between different industries is the result of the decline of the rate of profit or the underconsumption of the masses, even though it in turn influences them. Where on the basis of a certain rate of profit there is a certain tempo or rate of accumulation, it is here the rate of profit that determines the demand for means of production and makes for a certain relation between the demand for the products of the Department of Means of Production and the demand for the products of the Department of Means of Consumption. A decline in the rate of profit, by causing a decline in the rate of accumulation, immediately changes the pattern of demand, and so the proportional relations that previously existed between the production of the means of production and the production of the consumption of and the production of the means of consumption is turned into a disproportional relation. A similar relation exists between the underconsumption of the masses and the proportionality or disproportionality between the different industries. As Lenin said, quote, the, quote, small consuming power of society, end quote, and, quote, the proportionality of the various branches of production, end quote. These are absolutely not identical, independent, unconnected conditions. These are absolutely not individual, independent, unconnected conditions. Did I say identical before? I feel like I said that. I don't know if I said that. That's wrong if I did say that. These are absolute. Let me restart the whole quote. Quote, the, quote, small consuming power of society, end quote, and, quote, the proportionality of the various branches of production, end quote. These are absolutely not individual, independent, unconnected conditions. On the contrary, a certain state of consumption is one of the elements of proportionality, end quote. Lenin. One of the expressions of disproportional development of different industries is the changes in the output of raw materials in comparison with the demand for them. This expresses itself in changes in the price of raw materials compared with the price of finished goods. In those cases, at the beginning of the revival, the supply of raw material exceeds the demand, and their prices are therefore low. With the upswing of economic activity, the price of raw materials rises, thus increasing the cost of production, which adversely affects the rate of profit. Footnote: see Marx Capital, Volume 3, pages 140 to 141. And footnote. The fact that the price of raw materials rises more than the price of finished goods during a boom and falls much more steeply during a crisis is due to the supply of raw materials being far less elastic than the supply of finished goods. An additional factor expressing the disproportionality between different industries, which is more the result rather than a cause of the economic cycle, but which is nevertheless an important reflex influence, is the rate of interest. The active capitalist, the entrepreneur, does not receive the whole surplus value, but only what remains after the deduction of rent, taxes, and interest. In general, at the beginning of the revival, there is an excess of credit over the demand for credit, so that the rate of interest is low, in turn encouraging revival. During a boom, the rate of interest continues low until a short time before the end of the boom. Then it rises sharply, reaching the rate of interest maximum with the crisis. After that, it falls sharply. Thus, while the curve of the general rate of profit and the curve of the economic cycle as a whole roughly correspond, the rate of interest curve shows much more convulsive zigzags, cutting across the curve of the economic growth. It is very high at the height of the boom and of the crisis. It serves on the one hand to spur the revival on to a wild gallop, and on the other to deepen the crisis. One aspect of the relation between the rate of interest and the rate of profit, and the profit of enterprise, is the plethora and dearth of credit. Credit has made it possible for capitalism to advance at an unprecedented tempo, but at the same time, credit increases the instability of the system. Credit blinds the industrialist to the real situation of the market, so that the industrialists continue to expand production beyond the point at which the industrialists would have stopped if all payments were done in cash. This postpones the actual outbreak of the crisis, only it deepens it when it comes. One further contributory factor in bringing about the crisis is the chain of middlemen that usually exists between the industrial capitalists and the consumers. Owing to their activity, production can, within certain limits, increase without the sale of products to consumers correspondingly increasing. The unsold products remain as stocks in the hands of merchants. Footnote: see Karl Marx, Capital, Volume 2, pages 86 to 87. End footnote. New section. State capitalism and the crisis. The posing of the problem. Even a superficial glance shows that some of the causes which bring about a crisis of overproduction in traditional capitalism would not exist under conditions of state capitalism. For instance, the last factor mentioned above, the chain of middlemen between producers and consumers, which blinds the producers to the true situation of the market, not only would not exist under state capitalism, but even in private enterprise is theoretically capable of elimination by the industrialist selling his product directly to the consumer through a trading network of his own. Credit, too, as a factor encouraging production beyond the point production would go if all payments were in cash, as well as the influence of the rate of interest as a factor accentuating the boom and deepening the crisis, would not act under state capitalism as a contributory cause of the oscillatory movements of production. Here, as the state is the owner of all capital, credit functions in fundamentally the same way as if each capitalist used his own capital. In other words, as if credit does not exist at all. The factor of disproportionality as the initial cause of the crisis, not as an accompanying phenomenon of the decline of the rate of profit or under consumption of the masses, will also not exist under state capitalism. Although mistakes in investment are not excluded, and it is possible that the supply of a certain product may exceed the demand, the fact that the state plans production and demand excludes wide disproportionalities. Moreover, as the state is the owner of all industries, in place of the cumulative process of decline in prices and a decline of the rate of profit which spreads from one industry to another, the whole economy will directly bear the difficulties which are the result of a partial overproduction. Then, when the next production turnover takes place, the production of this product will be decreased, and equilibrium restored. That these factors do not exist is conditioned on a consideration of the internal relations of the state capitalist economy alone. If the state capitalist economy produces for the world market, receives credit from other countries, etc., these factors will have a certain influence on it. This will be dealt with more extensively below. But what about the fundamental dilemma, which traditional capitalism is always faced with? How can a high rate of profit be achieved while at the same time the surplus value is realized? How can a quick accumulation of capital be undertaken without undermining the market, which is necessary for it? We know that in a certain phase of the cycle, the boom, traditional capitalism temporarily solves the problem. A high rate of profit brings about a quick accumulation, that is, a big rise in the production of means of production relatively to the means of consumption, so that the market for the realization of a big part of the surplus value is the department of means of production. This alone is sufficient to explain why the underconsumption of the masses does not cause a permanent crisis and prevent the expansion of production under capitalism altogether. This alone is sufficient to explain why the underconsumption of the masses does not cause a permanent crisis and prevent the expansion of production under capitalism altogether. If capitalism could transform the phase of the boom from a temporary to a permanent one, overproduction would never exist. Can state capitalism do this? Can state capitalism ensure a high rate of profit, a high rate of accumulation, a high level of production, while yet preserving the antagonistic way of distribution, quote, the poverty and restricted consumption of the masses, end quote? Before answering these fundamental questions, we shall diverge a little from our subject, but only to take a shortcut to the answer. Two important economists tried to prove that, however restricted the consumption of the masses, a crisis of overproduction is not inevitable. The one is Mikhail Tugen-Baranovsky, the original theoretician of revisionism, the other F.A. von Hayek, the outstanding bourgeois economist. Their analyses may serve a useful purpose as an introduction to the solution of the problem posed. Section 5. Hayek. Dr. Hayek, in his book Prices and Production, published in 1931, describes the structure of production as a triangle made up of different layers of production. The base is the means of consumption end, and the apex is the producer's good end. During recovery and boom, as Hayek correctly states, the production of means of production increases as against the production of means of consumption. During a crisis, the production of means of production drops sharply, the drop being larger than that of the production of means of consumption. Recovery and boom produce the sides of the triangle, lengthening the structure, while the crisis shortens it. Again, Hayek correctly concludes from this that in order to make the boom a permanent phenomenon, it is necessary to keep on raising the apex. Concretely, this means that there should be a continuously high rate of profit and high rate of accumulation, so that the production of means of production is always big compared with the production of means of consumption. How can this be achieved? With the technical change, workers and capital must be transferred from the production of means of consumption to the production of means of production. More people will be employed in the production of machinery in order to produce machinery, and so on, so that the total quantity of means of consumption produced will increase very slowly, notwithstanding the tremendous rise in productive capacity. John Strachey, who deals fully with and competently criticizes Hayek's ideas in his book, The Nature of Capitalist Crisis, sums up the Hayekian, quote, solution in these terms. The structure of production must get, quote, the structure of production must get longer and longer. The sides of the Hayekian triangle must be produced and produced. This, then, is the Hayek-Robbins solution of the dilemma. It is possible, they imply, for all the conditions which are necessary to the existence of capitalism to be fulfilled simultaneously. It is possible for wages to be kept down to, quote, economic levels, and yet for there to be no glut of consumers' commodities. For if the demand for consumers' commodities is thus minimized, no excess of consumers' commodities will be produced. The entire increase of society's productive power will be devoted to increasing the production of production's goods. And if this is done, then there will be no need to increase the ultimate market. The entire increase in the supply of commodities will be an increase in producers' commodities, which can be absorbed within the structure of production. For that structure will be getting longer and longer. Even there will be no need for any increased supply of actual consumers' commodities ever to emerge from the production process. Industry can take in its own washing on an ever more gigantic scale and forever. The overwhelming majority of mankind can continue to live on a subsistence level in perpetuity, and our ever-growing powers of production can be permanently absorbed by the task of producing new means of production. Thus, there need be no crisis. Capitalism need never feel the lack of a larger market for consumer goods. It will never increase the production of consumer goods. The market for which capitalism will produce will be within itself. It will be within its own ever-lengthening structure of production. The market for which capitalism will produce will be within capitalism's self. The market for which capitalism will produce will be within capitalism's own ever-lengthening structure of production. End quote. John Strachey, in his book, again, what's the book called? The Nature of Capitalist Crisis, published in 1935. New section, Section 6, Tugen-Baranovsky. Similar conclusions were reached by Tugen-Baranovsky about 50 years ago. However low the rate of profit, Tugen-Baranovsky says, and however low the purchasing power of the masses, no crisis need break out if a certain relation be kept between the two departments of industry, so that means of consumption decline more and more relatively to means of production. Taking his conclusion to its end, Tugen-Baranovsky writes, quote, if all workers except one disappear and are replaced by machines, and this one single worker will place the whole enormous mass of machinery in motion, and with its assistance produce new machines, and the consumption goods of the capitalist. The working class will disappear, which will not in the least disturb the self-expansion process, the Verwertungsprozess of capital. The capitalist will receive no smaller mass of consumption goods. The entire product of 1 year will be realized and utilized by the production and consumption of the capitalist in the following year. Even if the capitalists desire to limit their own consumption, no difficulty is presented. In this case, the production of capitalist consumption goods partially ceases, and an even larger part of the social product consists of means of production, which serve the purpose of further expanding production. For example, iron and coal are produced, which serve always to expand the production of iron and coal. The expanded production of iron and coal of each succeeding year uses up the increased mass of products turned out in the preceding year, until the supply of necessary minerals is exhausted. End quote. Tugendbaranovsky, Theoretische Grundlagen des Marxismus. Clearly, as Tugendbaranovsky himself remarks, the main point of his analysis is not, quote, the wholly arbitrary and unreal assumption that the replacement of manual labor by machinery leads to an absolute diminution of the number of workers, but rather the thesis that, given a proportional distribution of social production, no decline in social consumption is capable of producing a superfluous product, end quote. Tugendbaranovsky. Quoted in Paul Sweezy. And footnote. New section, section 7. Why the Hayek-Tugen quote solution is impossible under individual capitalism. Tugendbaranovsky's and Hayek's quote solution is impossible of realization under individual capitalism because the mutual dependence of the two departments of production and the blind method of exchange between them. Capitalist production is on the one hand a production of use values. On the other, capitalist production is the production of values. Insofar as it is the production of use values, its aim is independent of the social form of production, the aim being the satisfaction of human needs. Insofar as the production of values, its aim is accumulation, quote, to conquer the world of social wealth, to increase the mass of human beings exploited by him, bracket, the capitalist, end bracket, end quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1, page 649. Though the capitalist consider use value, but the bearer of value, though the capitalists consider consumption as a means and not an end, nevertheless the means is vital, as without it the end cannot be achieved. The former cannot exist without the latter. Quote, consumption produces production by creating the necessity for new production. ... No wants, no production, but consumption reproduces the want. End quote. Marx, Critique of Political Economy. The dependence of accumulation on consumption necessarily means the dependence of the department of means of production on the department of means of consumption. Under individual capitalism, this dependence works out blindly. If the ratio of the supply and demand of means of production increases relatively to that of means of consumption, the price of means of production will decrease relatively to the price of means of consumption. As a result, the rate of profit will decrease in Department 1, means of production, and increase in Department 2, means of consumption. The outcome will be 1. A slackening of accumulation in the means of production department and an acceleration of it in the means of consumption department. This will continue till proportionality between the two departments is restored. A necessary element in this process is the free movement of the price of commodities and the free movement of capital from one department to another department. An additional element is the rise in the wage rate consequent following on the extensive employment in the means of production department which causes an increase in the demand for the products of the means of consumption department. These factors make the application of the Hayek-Tugan quote solution impossible under individual capitalism. New section, Section 8. The Hayek-Tugan quote solution can be realized for a certain time under state capitalism. The Hayek-Tugan solution, despite its absurdity from a capitalist standpoint, objectively has a sound basis. The quote solution is in reality merely the extension of the phase of revival and boom in the economic cycle, a phase in which accumulation increases more than personal consumption, and the production of means of production increases more quickly than the production of means of consumption. For a certain number of years, accumulation can far exceed consumption without disturbing the equilibrium. This and the fact that the material basis which unites the cycle of the rate of profit, accumulation, and employment is the life and death of fixed capital, machinery, buildings, etc., suggests that if it were possible to prevent increased production in the means of consumption department, and at the same time continuously and steadily to increase production in the means of production department, the length of the boom would be longer than in the decennial cycle. This can be done by state capitalism. The state, by the state's ownership of the total capital, can, while greatly increasing the production of the means of production department relatively to the means of consumption department, prevent the stream of capital from the means of production department to the means of consumption department. The state capitalism eliminates another cause of the turn from boom to crisis under individual capitalism, and gives a basis for the realization of the Hayek-Tugan quote solution for a time. Under individual capitalism, a high rate of profit causes quick accumulation, extensive employment, and high wages. This process proceeds to a point where the wages reach such a level that the rate of profit is adversely affected and drops catastrophically, dragging down with it accumulation, employment, and wages. When the workers under capitalism are relatively, quote, free to bargain over the sale of their labor power, the, quote, relative surplus population is, the pivot upon which the law of demand and supply of labor works. It confines the field of action of this law within the limits absolutely convenient to the activity of exploitation and to the domination of capital, end quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1. Under a totalitarian state capitalist regime, even if there is relatively no surplus population and full employment prevails, wages can for a long time remain, quote, within the limits absolutely convenient to the activity of exploitation and to the domination of capital, end quote. The Tugan-Hayek quote solution is therefore possible of realization in a state capitalism which lags behind world capitalism, in which means of production are scarce, and where therefore the production of machinery in order to produce more machinery, and so on, reflects the necessities of the national capitalist economy. What will happen when the production of machinery to produce machinery, and so on, raises the state capitalist country out of its backwardness? Will the crisis of overproduction break out in highly developed state capitalist economies? The only Marxist theoretician to pose and deal with this question was Bukharin. Okay, that's the end of part 1. I'm going to arbitrarily cut it off here. The next section is titled Bukharin on the Crisis in State Capitalism.